Okay, so Jackie Darren needs to be promoted.
Okay, Macon and Sarah, I think you're doing that.
Yep, doing that right now.
Good. Okay. And Julie and Emily, we're ready? Okay.
Yep, good.
Let's get started here. Call the meeting to order of the Futures Committee for Monday, September 14th. Welcome all, both panelists as well as guests that are joining us. We're honored today to have Francella Ochillo, and she's Executive Director for Next Century Cities. And we'll let Jackie introduce her in just a moment. But we've been a longtime friend of Next Century Cities when we began our journey as it relates to our high-speed broadband in Fort Collins. And I'll tell the story for Francella, but basically back in 2011, we had some conversations, some here at the Futures Committee, to what is our digital future. And we invited our incumbent providers to our Futures Committee. And basically, when we posed the question, what's a digital future for Fort Collins, they really didn't provide an answer. It was really one of, we're programming and things like that. It really didn't talk about a future of future-proofing our city for a digital future. And so that commenced our journey to, and through two or three votes. One was just to have the ability to have a conversation because of some state legislation. We couldn't even discuss having internet as a city. And then we had one vote to commence discussions, and then another vote to that actually approved the bonding and so forth moving forward. So we're now in the midst of our build out. We have customers related to our 1 to 10 gig symmetric service through to every premise within our community. So our community is excited for our municipal broadband, and it's called Connection. And that's the connection back, pardon the pun, back to the Futures Committee. And a little bit about Futures Committee. The Futures Committee is a subcommittee of council. So myself and Emily Gorgol and Julie Pignataro are join me on this committee. And we have topics that basically, unlike many things that council deals with, are very much the here and now. We lift our heads up and we look at the horizon and think about the future of our community. And so we have we take the opportunity to think about the future of our community, and are we on the right vector, or whatever that might be, to the future. And we have a broad-ranging set of topics that we explore on a monthly basis. And with that, we have I think some interesting conversations. We bring in thought leaders like yourself to our community. And with that, we can have some, we have some, I think, conversations about where we are, where we want to go. And we talk about this in terms of we're a plan and do think tank, and thinking about a think and do future, so we may not have some direct actions coming out of here, but we get some thinking going. And as I mentioned with broadband and connection, it does yield results over a period of time, if depending on the conversations that we have. So that's some background. And what's usually the case with this, not only is it a subcommittee of council where we have thought leaders and have a conversation, but we also usually attract a lot of staff members throughout our city, organization as well as community members, just because of the topics that we have and the conversation that we have. So, that's one of the aspects I think that are valuable about the Futures Committee. So, with that, our first item of business, we have the minutes from July 13th to approve, and I'll ask either Emily or Julie to make a motion, and if we're ready to second it, then we'll do that.
Yeah, I move approval of the July 13th minutes for the Futures Committee.
Second.
Thank you. And there's a motion to approve our minutes. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So those are approved. And with that,
Excuse me, Mayor Troxel. I'm sorry, this is Carrie Daggett.
Carrie?
And I just wanted to note that you need to do a roll call vote for remote hearings. I'm
okay.
sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so for that vote, we will do roll call. So do we have our city clerk, or who would play that role?
We've ended
Carrie
up.
just volunteered herself for a job.
Sure. Here, I'll even turn my video on.
Yeah.
So you can.
Carrie, I'm supposed to be in second place.
Oh,
Darren.
sorry, Darren.
Darren likes doing roll call. I'll turn it over to Darren.
Darren?
Thank you. Julie Pignataro,
Yes.
Emily Gorgel,
Yes.
Mayor Troxel.
Yes, so it's approved.
Okay, thanks, Carrie.
And thank you for stepping in there, Darren and Carrie. And with that, we are now to our think tank discussion for this month. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jackie to introduce our guest.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor, and good evening, members of the Council Futures Committee. If you'll recall, when COVID hit and we reconvened the Council Futures Committee, you all brainstormed a list of topics that you thought would be especially timely to think about right now as we look towards the future of our community, especially in the context of response and recovery and regeneration to COVID. And of course, the concept of as we're rolling out connection in our community and the seeds that were kind of stowed here in Futures for connection, and all the impacts of COVID on virtual and remote learning, virtual work, the issues of digital inclusion and access have become front and center in our community and communities across the world. And so this was one of the topics that you wanted to see on your agenda in the next few months. And we're just so delighted to have a thought leader like Francella join us here today. So I'm just going to share a little bit about Francella's background so you know what all she's bringing to this presentation. And also I want to thank Coleman Keene, our Executive Director of Connection, for making the connection to Francella. When I reached out to Coleman and Nina and Ginny about Council Futures Committee's interest in this topic, right away Coleman said, oh, if you can snag Francella, that would be perfect. And a huge thanks to Francella for saying yes. So Francella is an attorney and digital rights advocate who has worked on a variety of technology and telecommunications issues with a specific focus on assessing the impact on underrepresented communities. And so big connections to Council's priority around equity and inclusion as well. As Executive Director of Next Century Cities, she leads efforts to help policymakers and lawmakers at every level of government recognize the importance of ubiquitous broadband and community partnerships. Francella's organization's work supports a bipartisan coalition of local officials who are expanding high-speed internet opportunities for their residents. A member of the District of Columbia Bar and Federal Communications Bar Association, Francella also represents Next Century Cities on the SCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee's Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group. And so Francella's deeply rooted in this important work and in the work that we're facing here in Fort Collins and familiar with Fort Collins. And as you saw in the links that we sent out to the committee, Next Century Cities has featured the work in Fort Collins, and Francella and the organization's thought partnership is really an ongoing relationship. And we're fortunate to experience that tonight with this presentation to Futures. And so with that, Francella, I will turn it over to you. And thanks again for being here.
Well, Jackie, Megan, thank you so much for the warm welcome. Mayor, thank you so much just for even acknowledging the work that Next Century Cities is doing. Sometimes we're the silent partner, and we just want to make sure that we are propping up local officials. So we're really excited that we could be helpful in any way for Fort Collins, and hope that that's the beginning of something really beautiful in the years to come. And also, I don't know if Coleman Keene is on the line today, but it is true that I've run into him several times in my meetings that I schedule with FCC commissioners, people who know me on the work group. My goal is specifically to make sure that local officials and community leaders have a space in federal policymaking. You know, the solutions that we need to come up with for the digital divide are inherently local, and I don't think that it makes sense that we can make federal policy without consulting with local officials and community leaders. So I do make it a personal charge to make sure that we're connecting the dots. And I encourage any of you who would like to be more involved in that process. My door is always open. There is always room for you at my table. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about Next Century Cities, and I also look forward to learning more about the work that you guys are doing in Fort Collins. But for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, Next Century Cities is a 501c3 nonprofit. People are always surprised that we don't collect dues. We actually are supported by foundations, and our goal is specifically to support local efforts to expand connectivity. So if we go to the first slide, it's going to tell you a little bit of our organization, and specifically our work is to support mayors, CIOs, CTOs, digital inclusion officers, digital equity officers, a range of local officials, as well as residents who are really demanding change in their communities. We want to make sure that they actually have a voice, not only at the federal level, but also at the state level of government. So we're here to build awareness, to share some of the storytelling, to make sure that we are amplifying the work that's happening in communities. All of our members, what they do share in common is that they all realize the far-reaching impact that broadband has on other parts of their community. So they understand that access and adoption will have an impact on educational outcomes, economic outcomes, health outcomes, and much, much more. Moving on to the next slide, I did want to acknowledge that I am not talking to a group of neophytes. Unlike a lot of cities around the nation, Fort Collins has a very deep-rooted history of advocacy for broadband. That is something that I don't see in many places. For example, I don't think that I've seen it anywhere other than Detroit, maybe some places in Washington, where I could actually reach out to residents and they have a command of what does broadband access mean. I am from Louisiana, where I think a lot of people still just want to really keep it really plain language. Can I get on the internet? Can I get online? And I think that just because your community has really had to elevate this issue, actually lobby residents on the importance of broadband access and make this an actual voting issue, I think you guys are leagues ahead of a lot of other municipalities. Also, what's really important about what's happening in Fort Collins is that you actually have the support of local officials. I think that in a moment of COVID, where there's an assumption that especially when universally, municipalities across the country are worried about students getting online. Quite frankly, some local officials don't know where to start. And so it's not that they don't want to help. They might honestly not know what is the first step, what is the second step. And so it's really important that local officials are educated and that we are actually also making sure that they have the language to not only make an ask for levels of government that are above them that might have other resources, but also to be able to translate that for residents so that they can actually have the community support for the types of projects that they want to implement. Moving on to the next slide, I did want to outline a timeline. Actually, the mayor started way back in 2011. In my background memo, it actually really went back to 2012. So I learned something today as well. But these are some of the things that were flagged for me that I thought were really important pieces in terms of the timeline. And the reason why the timeline matters, and we'll revisit that later, is because any meaningful, whether it be digital inclusion, digital equity planning, really thinking about structural change to broadband access requires long-term planning as well as long-term community partnerships. those are things that cannot, the programs depend on the success of having ongoing renewed interest in the issue. That means that we have to be constantly learners of that issue. We have to think about, do the programs have adequate funding, not just in year one, but in an ongoing basis to make sure that they have oxygen. And so when you can show that you actually have a long-term commitment to these programs, it's a lot easier to actually gauge their success. And another thing that I wanted to point out, I think that it was a really big deal about launching your fiber network. I actually remember when I was joining Next Century City, Next Century Cities, Fort Collins was all over our, it was really exciting, you know, connection, you know, and I saw the press releases and the write-ups. And so I joined Next Century Cities back in July of 2019. So there was a lot of fuss about it around then. And I think that it's really important that when we're showing that cities that maybe aren't as easy to reach or might have geological challenges, that when you can show we can do it here, that means we can do it anywhere. So the work that you guys are doing is not only important for your residents, but also to serve as an example for local officials who are wondering, how do I take my first step? How can we have the type of connectivity that exists in Fort Collins? Finally, I wanted to point out a 2020 statistic, because I think that it's always important to measure where are we now. And especially when you have municipalities with community-based networks tend to have faster broadband speeds, lower costs, and higher adoption rates across the country. That's pretty much writ large. That tends to be a trend that we find everywhere. But I always want to point out, whether you're in Austin and it's the last 5%, or you're in Fort Collins and we're working on that last 10 or 11%, there's always work to do in terms of making sure that every single resident has a digital opportunity, that every single resident can get online in a meaningful way. And I don't mean just to get online, just open an email account, or maybe to comply with maybe opening up your bank account. I mean to be able to actually be a contributor to a digital ecosystem. And there are a lot of vectors that need to line up for us to be able to have that type of digital literacy after they've actually obtained access. So moving on to the next slide, I want to make sure that I'm pointing out a really important part of our language. A lot of the times, maybe in years prior, and less so now, when we talked about broadband access, we didn't acknowledge that adoption was a very separate issue. And some cities might have had they might have had broadband access plans, but they didn't bother taking the extra step of doing adoption, and not bother taking the extra step because they didn't want to. There might have been no additional resources. So that might have been the end of it. So the thing is, when we're talking about it, we know that for COVID, it's not enough to get the infrastructure to someone's neighborhood. We have to find a way to get it through the threshold of the front door, right? So that means that just as aggressive as we are about planning for broadband access strategies, we also need to be aggressive about planning broadband adoption strategies. So when we're talking about access, and I'll just go to the definition that I've shared with you here, access refers to proximity to the digital infrastructure that enables high-speed internet connections. Those connections that meet or exceed the FCC's 25.3 minimum benchmark are classified as broadband. When we're talking about adoption, that refers to whether an individual or a household actually subscribes to broadband. Affordability, access to equipment, gaps in digital literacy, these are all examples of what might be obstacles that prevent them from adopting. So again, just to make sure that we're level setting here, broadband access and adoption are two separate issues. Very often, funding is invested into the access strategies, and only the leftover amount is invested into the adoption strategies. The reason why that's problematic is that when it comes time to actually make sure that every single person can get online, what we found is that it's just not enough to say you have one or two choices in your neighborhood. We have to make sure that someone can afford it. We have to make sure that they have the digital equipment. We have to make sure that they understand how. And even beyond that step, that they have ongoing support in terms of their either their literacy and their training, but also because of tech support. Because very often when we have families that are using, whether it's refurbished equipment or maybe equipment that actually needs some sort of actual technical support, We don't always have those support systems set up in communities, and it's something that COVID has really exposed. So moving on to our next slide, talking about what goes into increasing those broadband adoption rates. So in Fort Collins, you guys know that it's really important to make sure that the actual digital infrastructure reaches everyone's neighborhood. And so whatever that takes, there has been an actual strategy to make sure that you can bring broadband within reach for every household. But how we're actually going to increase adoption relies heavily on what does the digital inclusion strategy look like, and does that digital inclusion strategy incorporate digital equity? So when we're thinking about digital inclusion, that is talking about the programs that help bring the broadband within reach for the most under-resourced households in our community. Who are the most under-resourced households nationwide? That's usually seniors, the disabled, communities of color, indigenous households, households that actually are English as a second language, places where we're looking and we know that there are additional barriers that even if they could subscribe and have one or two choices in their provider, there might be a reason why they don't take the additional step to adopt. So when we know, okay, so your city might have a digital inclusion strategy, it acknowledges, I think that, you know, there are a couple of communities that might need more support to get online. When we're talking about digital equity requires acknowledging that some of those populations are going to need more support than others. So that means that when we're talking about perhaps if we had $1,000 to share, and we know that we're talking about a couple of households in your community that you know for sure they can't get online, should we divide that up? If we had $10, should every single one of those 10 houses get $1? Or should we find a way to spend more money to the households that have shared issues and maybe less money or have different strategies to get to those other households? Because it doesn't always mean that it has to be an equal distribution for it to be effective. And that is where digital equity, it almost fights our instinct. Because when we're talking about equality, we're like, no, everybody should have the same amount. But is that really true when we think about maybe special education in school? We spend more money per student because somebody might need just a little bit more support to get online. And that's similar to when we're talking about households that might need just a little bit more support to get that connection through the front door. So moving on to the next slide, let's talk about what is success in terms of digital equity? What does that look like? And so when we're thinking about these goals, a lot of it has to start with actually being able to identify something that is shared. And so this might not be your goal as a community, but I'm going to use this just as an example for what we're doing here. So the example that I provided here, in case you're on the phone, it says identify a goal, and the example that I provided says all residents, including the most disadvantaged, must have access to a broadband connection, the requisite tools, and training opportunities that enable them to fully participate in a digital society. If we're to read that sentence just in isolation, there are a lot of parts that need to be addressed when we're thinking about what does a successful strategy look like. Number one, this cannot be accomplished with any one investment, any singular instance of being able to solve this problem. We know that it's going to be ongoing because we're trying to make sure that everyone has the actual service, that they have the digital tools, that they have the training opportunities. That is an ongoing endeavor. And so we know that just from the outset, that's going to be something that requires a commitment. Also, when we're acknowledging that we're talking about all residents, even the most disadvantaged, it's really important to understand, what are we calling disadvantaged? What are we calling, if you said under-resourced or the low income, whatever it is that's in your digital equity statement, you really have to be able to have some sort of shared understanding of who is the most disadvantaged, because months later into implementing that strategy, it will take some of the angst and the question marks out of why are we putting resources behind X. Because if you can identify whoever's that community in need from the outset, or at least try to actually name what you're trying to accomplish, it makes it a lot easier and less murky about those other question marks about should we, because there's definitively, yes, we should. So once you've identified whatever is your community's shared goal, it's also important to make sure that you're collecting data on what is the state of connectivity now, not 2 years ago, not 5 years ago when we were still using T-Mobile Sidekicks, not when you were on your iPhone 4, but the statistics now. Because even if we're to look at statistics from 2017, they're largely outdated. And if we look at national statistics, that might not fit your community. So it's really important to actually have some sort of local auditing to find out, well, who's connected and who's not. And in COVID, it's been easier to identify that by people with school children, because now you know, well, this student is registered and can't get online. So we know there's a problem at that address. But what happens when we have seniors or adults without children? We have the disabled who might not be able to get online. We need to be able to do an honest audit of who is disconnected in the community. And once we do that audit, we also need to be asking really hard questions about the barriers to adoption. And I think one thing I want to point out, especially when we're talking about barriers to adoption that are associated with affordability. As a first generation American and thinking about poverty in the United States, one thing when we study municipalities across the country, one of the things that they have in common is that the most disconnected populations, it does not matter if we're talking about somebody in West Virginia, Memphis, Tennessee, Lost Hills, California, it does not matter what city we're in, it sucks. It doesn't matter. It's unpleasant. I know that my opportunities are limited. I'm stressed. It's not only about me, that it's like, can my kid get online? There's so much, right? But there's something here that the poverty, it's what they all share in common is cycles of poverty for the people who are really struggling, because it's not just the digital access issue when we're dealing with households at the poverty line. Sometimes there's food insecurity, housing insecurity. There's a lot of issues that collide that very often when people have students, schools tend to be the first responders because they can respond to several issues. Does the kid need health care? Do they need to go to the nurse? Do they need to get lunch? You know, schools tend to be a hub where we get to solve a lot of those problems, and we don't have that same hub for adults. But there's something about when the cycles of poverty, when they're cloaked in shame, right? And so, and I think that, and I want to point that out because it's really hard to reach out to someone who's disconnected and say, are you disconnected because you can't afford it? I might not come out and tell you I can't afford it. But what the numbers tell us is that when people are at or even lingering around the poverty line, like being able to afford it tends to be an ongoing issue. So it's going to be difficult to identify what's that magic number that people can afford. And I feel like that's one part of this assessment, that it doesn't matter which city we're in. I don't think that anyone has mastered that analysis, but I think that we need to go into that analysis with compassion, because very often the people who are asking those questions are not the people who are struggling with poverty. And if poverty is cloaked in shame, and it says something in the US about like, well, I didn't try hard enough. You're poor because you didn't fight hard enough, or you didn't have the right circumstances, you should have done more. If we know that poverty is soaked in shame, it's going to be very difficult to get authentic answers as to why someone doesn't adopt. So I just want to make sure we're approaching that piece of the analysis with compassion, because the numbers tell us that if you're at or below the poverty line, that dollars are an issue. Doesn't matter which city you're in. Also, as you're doing that analysis, it's really important that we go through and actually figure out what community resources are available. And they might be non-financial resources. They might not be the ones that you list on your balance sheet. One of the most beautiful things that came up, we're doing a case study talking to people in Huntsville, Alabama, and one of the most important community resources for their digital inclusion resources is the local churches. And so, you know, it's just one of those things that's not something we can record on a balance sheet. It's not going to show up on your city budget. But if you have community partnerships that can actually give you some sort of social capital, like real community leadership capital, that is a resource that can also help close some of these connectivity gaps. I want to take this time to really think about the next suggestion is to really think about engaging a variety of stakeholders. And one of the things that I personally I feel like is almost like my duty when I'm at the FCC, when we're in meetings and it's a lot of like-minded people, you know, in DC, I've been in DC since 2007. I'll never, ever, ever get used to the, you know, the opening question is, what do you do? If anybody's been here, so I'm from a place in Louisiana where your opening question is, how are you doing? And people there wait to hear the answer. The way, like, how's your mama doing? How's your aunt doing? Did you say hi to your family? You know, it's like, oh, great, I got this new job. Cool, did you see your family? Oh, I won a Nobel Prize. Did you see your family? You know, that's always gonna be the most important question, right? But in DC, the most important question is like, oh, hey, what do you do? That's like the opener, right? And it worries me that when people, their opener, you know, things are, and it's not a diss to anybody who's from DC. I've lived here for a long time. I want to acknowledge that the way that people who do have a lot of resources think about problem solving is going to be a lot different than people who have to make decisions about, can I pay my car insurance bill this month? Can I sign my kid up for cheerleading? Can we afford to have extra data this month? That decision making looks a lot different when you actually have to think, can I get my car fixed? And I think that sometimes we forget, because we'll be in these rooms and say, well, these people, they're experts. They're experts. Everybody's an expert, you know? And I've been doing telecom for a minute, and I'm told I'm not an, you know, I'll like go in and they're like, how'd you get in here? It's like, you know, it's like, I don't know what it takes to be the expert, right? But what I do know is that I'm not gonna go to a community meeting and say, hey, you guys, let's build a house, and not include an architect, right? I'm not gonna say, oh, let's make a loaf of sourdough bread, and not include somebody who knows something about baking. So why would I try to solve digital divide issues without including some of the most disconnected people? And I feel like it's a really easy thing that we overlook, because a lot of the times at that table, we have all of these great reasons for why all these people are soaked in expertise. It's like, oh, that person can just like literally recite FCC code. That's awesome. That's great. But if we want to find out, why is it that consistently people in this zip code, or why is it that at this school we are struggling with this amount of disconnectivity? Why is it that it's the families, you know, with this condition that are struggling with access? Like, if we know that, then that means that we with resources have to do everything within our power to bring their voices to the table. Now, maybe they can't come to your city council meetings. Maybe they can't get involved in like secret special work groups, but maybe that means we need to go knock on doors and leave a Post-it note. Maybe that means we need to call them on landline phones and teach people how to use those. Like, whatever that is. Because my nephew asked me what a landline phone was the other day. So, but he honestly did not know. So, you know, but I'm saying whatever it is that we need to do to reach people, we need to get really creative about solving this problem when we think about the enormity of the problem and the amount of brain power that we've already had involved and haven't been able to solve it. So I encourage you to really think about, what does a variety of stakeholders mean? And when you're in those meetings, asking each other questions about your outreach efforts. Finally, I do want to say that it's important for us to identify specific metrics for success. Because if at the outset your goal is to say, we want 100% of students in X, Y, and Z school districts to be able to get online, then that's a great metric to know, did we get there? Because very often a community might be able to set metrics that really don't need to be recorded on a balance sheet in the same way. You might have your own set of metrics that you think is important to actually evaluate your community's success. So moving on to the next slide, I do want to acknowledge some of the challenges that might come with any municipality coming up with digital equity strategies. Number one, although digital equity is something that is on the minds of this, council and then also like some of your departments, I always acknowledge that for some communities, for some households, digital equity, this might be the first time they're saying those words. This might be the first time that this has come up. And quite frankly, I don't want that to be met with like blame or shame. I want us to meet people where they are. And so really acknowledging the fact that sometimes people genuinely have never thought of it. So how are we actually presenting this as an opportunity rather than a threat for compliance? So we have to really be thinking about how can we actually ask people to join our tribe to say this is for the good of the larger good of the community, rather than to meet people with threats, to implement that into their work streams. Also, as I mentioned before, defining what is affordable, especially when you have that last 10% that you're trying to get online, is going to be very difficult, because the truth is that especially in really unconventional times, whether it's a Lifeline program at $9.95 a month or a program that's $19.95 a month in your community, being able to afford that might not be realistic for some communities, and sometimes that affordability number is going to be zero. So just really thinking carefully about, if that number is zero, what resources do we have to offset that? Also, I think that it's important for us to think about what community level partnerships do you have in place that will actually help in an ongoing way meet evolving benchmarks for digital literacy. As I said before, what it took for me to maybe use my phone 5 years ago is very different than now. And the way that we're thinking about the way you used your laptop, the way you used your iPad, what is going to be called on for us to understand and know and really think of as a second language will look very different 3 years from today. And so it's not enough that we feel like, oh, okay, we won, we got it, we got a couple of community partnerships in place. We really need to be thinking about what do we need in the future to sustain that. And then also, I think that it's important to really acknowledge that, especially in the times of COVID, local officials are constantly in a reactive posture. It is very, very difficult to get into a position where you're thinking about forward-looking, what do we want out of this digital ecosystem? Who do we want to contribute? How do we want people to get online? And what do we want when they get there? And so really thinking about if we can ever just intentionally take breaks like this one, just to dream together, just to think through what's possible. And that's something that I want to tease out in some of the questions that I'll ask you now. So when we move on to the next slide, one thing that I want to stay on your mind is to really be thinking every single time this topic is coming up, to think about how will widespread broadband access and adoption change outcomes for residents in Fort Collins. It is not enough for us to say, we want to get to 98% of residents to get online for X number of whatever. There's nothing inspiring about that. And I think that it's important for us to think about, yeah, that's part of the work. As local officials, as community leaders, we want everybody to be able to participate. But when we think about what comes of that, it's like, to what end? Are we doing that so that we can make sure that every single kid in Fort Collins can literally have educational opportunities that go beyond the borders of Colorado? Are we thinking that, about what it actually makes possible? And so it's really important to not necessarily limit yourself to thinking about the problems that we're solving now, but really, how does this affect economic mobility? How does this fit into our overall strategy to find a place for arts and culture when we can't see people in person? What happens if Fort Collins was a place that was known as a tourist destination? How does connectivity fit into that picture? And really asking questions about how does widespread broadband access support those goals? Because very often we get stuck in the minutia of, right now we're putting out this fire and this is what I can see. And sometimes we have to intentionally think about all of the things that could be possible if there was widespread access. Secondly, another question that I think is important for us to continue to ask is, what are the long-term structural changes that we need to achieve those shared goals? And so what are the obstacles in place? What resources do we need? What do we need to do to create new resources and maybe pull on different partnerships? How can we tap our corporate residents to be partners in that endeavor? There are lots of questions that we need to ask about those long-term structural changes that are sometimes about relationship building and communications that we miss opportunities that are right in front of us. A third question that I think is really important for us to always ask is, have you made room at your table for new voices? And I can't reiterate enough that when we are physically sitting in a room, look around your table and ask who is there, who is deputized as an expert. Who is there and actually called an ambassador of the work that you're doing. So it's really important that we think beyond our comfort zones and really think about being inclusive about who would be a good deputy in this Army. And so I do want to just really quickly show this video, even if we only have a few minutes for it, where it's really about, at Next Century Cities earlier this year, I wanted to make sure that cities knew that we were thinking about the fact that there is room in our tribe for lots of different voices. And if you're good at writing and filings, we need you. If you're good at digital inclusion, we need you too. And that there's room for everybody.
There's a growing digital divide in our country.
If your city doesn't have healthy broadband, your city is not going to survive economically.
When you don't have sufficient access to broadband, you're not going to be able to participate in everyday decisions that our democracy makes.
Cities and towns need to be able to decide their broadband future. That should be decided for them by incumbent broadband providers.
We can't solve our biggest problems in America without broadband.
My parents really shaped my perspectives when it comes to broadband access and affordability. I come from a family of immigrants. My dad immigrated from Ethiopia during the 70s when he was facing political persecution. And he came to this country with really nothing but his own hard work and ingenuity. And he raised a family. And that really showed me that there's a lot of inequities in this country, and broadband access is just one of them.
Access to broadband service is critical in the 21st century. It is access to opportunity, to education, to healthcare, to financial services.
We talked to one state legislator who worked on bringing broadband to his community. He said, broadband may not save this community, but not having broadband would kill it. Climate change, agriculture, the economy, the list goes on and on. Each of these different problems requires solutions that ride on broadband networks. That's why broadband is fundamental. Learning what has been done, what can be done, that's the most empowering source of knowledge for broadband going forward.
States matter when it comes to broadband. States matter when it comes to getting folks online. They can serve as leaders and models for national leaders and for local leaders as well.
Next Century Cities is a great organization that is really at the front lines of trying to bring better connectivity to cities around the country, and we're excited to count them as a partner and ally.
This organization provides such crucial tools and resources for communities who just don't know where to start.
When I think of Next Century Cities, I think of the broad network of local elected officials that you represent, that they're an important voice as leaders in their community, leaders who understand that federal policy has an impact on the local level.
The reason NCC plays such an important role in this debate on broadband access is that regardless of where the communities are at, NCC is standing up. Whether it be an indigenous community, whether it be rural communities, Midwestern states, that's where NCC is doing their best work and standing up for those communities and making sure that everyone has access, regardless of where they are.
When I think of Next Century Cities, I think of cities connecting citizens, all the people in their communities, so that the communities will be stronger.
And thank you so much just for having me. That's all the time that I have for that. And I want to make sure that I create space so that we can ask questions. But I'm just so just in admiration of your advocacy, and I'm really excited to be a part of this part of your journey.
Thank you so much, Francella, and great presentation. I think it's incredibly timely for our community. As you know, we're at the point of building out, and that's just the basic infrastructure. But I think you've raised some questions for us to go further and to contemplate deeper as it relates to our community. And I'd like to, have that conversation around the questions, and I'll do a little just setting up. I loved your word ubiquitous as it relates to connectivity and a digital future. And one of the things that we try to do, and we're currently in a budgeting component of our our city budget, but we tend to focus on outcomes. So you ask, what's the outcome we're trying to achieve? And I think you're asking some questions that I think we need to go beyond just the build out that we've been focused on. And I think we have in some respects, but as it related to COVID and some of our neighborhoods not having access to connectivity, and we're in the build out period. So it's one of those that how can we provide connectivity even during the time when we're not to the point of deployment or turning on certain neighborhoods, if you will, within our community. So I think, and that's shown up with COVID and with students, primarily our K through 12 through our school district, which it doesn't fall under our governance, which they have their own board of a school board. But we've worked closely with a number of our other elected officials within our community. Just provide some characterization to Fort Collins. We're a community of about 175,000 people. We're the home of Colorado State University. We have Front Range Community College. And so we're a university city. That is one of the things that, I think supports the drive for connectivity, if you will. We've been along from the very beginning of the internet, even before it was called the internet, with regard to the coast-to-coast build-out because of some of the federal facilities and the universities. In the 70s, we were part of ARPANET and so forth. So, we've had a long history of digital connectivity, but now really taking it throughout our community is a key part of that. I remember when, and Darren can espouse on this, but when we had a conversation with Deb Sosha, and one of our attributes for building out a broadband utility is our electric utility. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we have our own distribution electric utility. We're a part of a partnership, a joint action agency, Platte River Power Authority, that is the generation transmission operator for 4 municipalities, Fort Collins being one, and we're about half of the energy offtake of Platte River. And related to that, Platte River, decades ago, started building out fiber rings in our community, and we've been a benefactor of that as well as we've gone to our connection and building out in our community. We're also a high-tech community with Intel and Broadcom and Woodward and a number of other high-tech companies, which also very much incumbent upon connectivity and reliable and big pipe, if you will. I think we have some good attributes, but also, the challenges that you've laid out, I think, is taking us further to looking at our entire community and the digital equity and inclusion, and thinking about outcomes. What are we actually trying to accomplish within our community, and the questions that you've raised. So thank you so much for that. And then I'll just open it up. And actually we have our committee here is a great one to have a conversation as relates to digital equity within our community. So anybody like to start off with some questions, comments, discussion? Okay, Julie, please.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Francella, for coming and for giving us the presentation. I have a couple questions, and maybe these are more going to be for Coleman. I see he's online, but it is something I haven't thought about, and that's for the affordability option. I know we have an option that is that, yeah, sorry, I was making sure it was out in the open of what our pricing is. It's way out in the open, so I apologize for that. It's been a long 2020. But if someone's affordability, if it's zero, you know, because those dollars do count when you're on the line of poverty, what are the options that we have for somebody if they can't afford it at all?
Well, I think that I see Coleman's come online. So I was like, I don't want to speak for you in terms of like what you're doing in Fort Collins, but I was just going to tell you largely why that was a conversation at the federal level. So at the federal level, that is part of why there's been a movement to actually have a broadband subsidy. So we have the Lifeline program, which is a program that it's essentially a $9.95 subsidy in which low-income individuals, so if you qualified for SNAP or some other government programs, you'd also qualify for Lifeline. You could get access to a landline phone or to a cell phone, which essentially gives you broadband access on your cell phone. So usually the providers offer as a courtesy the actual handset, but the subsidy is for your monthly subscription. And as long as you stay enrolled in the program and you can show once a year and verify that you're in need, then you could take advantage of it. A lot of the problems, Lifeline is riddled with issues, but it's only at approximately 33% of the eligible, only approximately 33% of the eligible population actually takes advantage of the program. When COVID hit, a lot of questions were raised as to number one, should we be investing more into Lifeline? Part of the issue that was raised was, well, what about people who are newly unemployed, who might not have necessarily been at the poverty line, but can afford nothing right now? And so that's what planted the seed for conversations about, well, is $9.95 affordable? What if nothing's affordable? Like, what do we do then? And so should we be coming up with ways to actually have a subsidy where people can essentially take that coupon to any provider and get some sort of service? And so those are questions that are very new, but only introduced because of COVID, and really have only been introduced over the past 2 months. But I'll let Coleman speak to what's happening in Fort Collins.
Yeah, and just to kind of take a step back. So one of the things that we talked about earlier was accessibility versus adoption. And so one of the reasons why we moved digital equity up into the general fund is so that we can get a broader city initiative going. If it was just accessibility, we would kind of leave it in connection. So having it at the general fund level gives us a lot of ability to engage a lot more programs in how we roll this out, and also other funding sources other than the pilot that Connection is paying today.
Darren?
Yeah, wait, thanks, Coleman. One thing I want to sort of introduce to the council. You all know Nina Bodenhammer, who's there. Nina, you should turn on your camera. Nina is really helping the city in this space. So when you think about Connection, we naturally think Coleman as executive director and the build and the billing system and things like that. But I want to make sure that the Futures Committee, I know Mayor Troxel, you know this, but Emily and Julie, Nina's really going to be helping us in this space. And so I think we ought to elevate you as a spokesperson in this conversation as well, Nina, because I know you've been strategizing with Coleman, with Jackie's group and so forth. And since I have my microphone unmuted, Francella, I want to say a couple things just real quickly. First of all, you've inspired me and you've inspired our team. I'm getting text messages, and you and I haven't met personally yet, but I'm city manager and I got to work with Deb, your predecessor, several years ago in a big way, and she was very resourceful, as the mayor said. So I'm getting texts. I just want Emily and Julie and Wade to know that, and I want you to know that as well, Francella, that people are really jazzed about this conversation and really excited and really impressed with you. So that's number one, and I'm thankful for the partnership that we've had with Next Century Cities. I want to add just a couple of seconds worth of, maybe minute worth, to what the mayor said earlier. I remember we were in a coffee shop with Deb in DC, and it was really early on, and I remember we said, she asked, so you have an electric utility? Yeah, check. You have a good relationship and high level of trust with your residents and your customers' utility ratepayers? Check. You've got in-house billing systems, and you've got locators, and you've got crews that build these things. Check, check, check. And I remember she looked at me, and I think Wade, you were in the meeting as well, and she said, so why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you considering a municipal broadband when you have this entire checklist? That was compelling to me, because we hadn't ever predetermined that we were going to do a municipal broadband. It was that rigor and that journey that we went through that sort of continually led to, well, an all private model isn't going to work. We're not on their radar. A public private model isn't going to work because we take the risk, they take the benefit. So we look through all those, and then finally, I think the Futures Committee, which played a very significant role in this conversation. And Francella, I'm sharing that because I know you tell stories about other communities as well. This network matters, but we didn't predetermine this outcome.
Yeah.
And so I just want to let you know that those, if we're really trying to have an impact on other communities and digital equity and some of this, I think our journey does matter, and I want to say Next Century Cities played a really important role. Right after that, we met Coleman at a Alliance for Innovation Big Ideas meeting, and started talking with him and so forth. So anyway, on behalf of my colleagues you see some pictures and some names, people are really grateful that you're part of this conversation.
I'm so glad. And I also just really want to quickly say that I agree that we do it. I think I personally want to make sure that we're storytellers, because I feel like local officials are very entrenched with local problem solving and don't always have the resources to amplify what's happening at the state and federal level. And I think that, wouldn't it be amazing if we could actually tell them the stories, whether it's successes or challenges, that you want them to take with them? Because when we get to FCC meetings, and Coleman knows this, there's this assumption that everybody's working on the shared set of facts. We know what communities need, but there's not necessarily any sort of intentional outreach to ask really basic questions that were in front of us. Because if you were trying to solve a problem for your family, you'd actually talk to your family members, find out what's the issue, who's involved, and ask how you could help. But when we get to having conversations, whether it's at the FCC or in Congress, all of a sudden those rules go out the door, and they're like, nah, we're pretty sure we got it figured out. And it's like, do we? And I just feel like sometimes it's just as simple as just asking, what do these communities need? How can we support what they're doing? And we're not, we're agnostic in terms of what type of model that you should choose, but we want to be supportive of the model that works for you. And so that's why I'm just really excited that this turned into such a great success story, much like how Lafayette, basically how they had their meeting with their providers and said, how can you improve connectivity for residents? And when they don't want to answer the question in the affirmative, they're like, no problem, we'll do this on our own. And it was a really ugly, long battle, but in the end, they're supporting connectivity in other counties. So it ended up being a great story. And I think that it's really exciting when you guys can actually recognize the fact that you're inspiring other communities, and that you actually think about, what story do you want them to tell about Fort Collins?
Thanks. We're only a third of the way into it, right, Coleman? We've pulled about 1 million feet of fiber, and we've got about 2 million more. And so we're not out of the weeds yet. But what I love for Wade and Julie and Emily and the people that are part of the so what now? You know, we're building this thing, and I think the big conversation is not only around the space that we're focusing on today, but how do we leverage this incredible network? And I'm just really jazzed that this is a topic for futures, and you know, if we look at maybe futures being sort of the, to some extent, the genesis of broadband deployment in Fort Collins, maybe futures is the genesis around digital equity and the space that we're talking about in access for all, and on and on and on. Maybe this meeting is one of those sort of plunk, you know, stick the post in the ground and say, we're onto something. So just to maybe provoke some more enthusiasm. I'm going to mute now because I'm dangerous.
That's good. You know, I think one of the things that's, you know, we've talked about access, and that's the miles that are in the ground and miles still to go. But, you know, I think what we haven't talked about as much are the barriers and the adoption. You know, we have an adoption hurdle rate that we're talking about, but what are the barriers and the adoption? And as it was discussed, and it's broader than just, you know, a hurdle rate to become economically viable. But what are the adoption that we need to be considering in this, I think, more granular aspect of deployment? I throw that out to everybody. Julie, yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because, and I don't really have any more questions, but more a lot of thoughts that were running through my head. And Francella touched on this a little bit, but, you know, once we do reach that adoption rate, we also have to ask what people have on the other end. Like, is a phone going to be appropriate to do the work a citizen needs to do? And, you know, we are very lucky that our local school district was able to give students that need it a hotspot and a laptop. But what about everyone else? And so these are just questions that are kind of going through my head as, you know, so I work in the tech industry during the day, and I think about it, the USDA, just the hundreds of laptops that are aged out, but are like 3 years old. You know, they're very adequate laptops, and I don't know where they go except in a storage room over on Center Avenue. And so it's, you know, people talk about connecting the dots, and I'm hoping in the future we can figure something like that out. And the other thing that occurred to me, and I'm almost ashamed it didn't occur to me until this point, is how much of an access point the library was for people. And that when those closed down, what that did. Because that's not only for wireless access on their devices, but also to computers. So I don't know if we have any library representatives on the line, but I'm wondering, now that they're sort of open, I'm not exactly sure how open they are, but I would think that some of the first things people would use was go right to those computer banks to get some work done. And maybe plugging into that population to see what it is that they need to fully reach that adoption level that we could look at. So again, thank you, Francella, for, you know, starting my wheels turning in my head. And yeah, this has been great.
And I want to point out the adoption piece on specifically about partnerships with libraries, because everybody knows how much I love librarians. Part of it is because just nationwide, approximately 25% of families who live at the poverty line relied previously, before COVID, on the library for their primary access to broadband. So the thing is, when those doors are closed, you know, I know that some libraries have come up with workarounds to loan the hotspots. And then others have done turning their Wi-Fi signals out into parking lots and things like that. But the truth of the matter is, you know, it's like winter is coming, and we need to really have something that's sustainable. And, you know, in terms of just, it's not enough to have people in parking lots or, you know, hanging out on the side of the road near like a food establishment. And I also want to point out, in terms of when we're thinking about the benchmark of who we're trying to connect, When we focus only on students, very often you'll get to the students who are enrolled. When we focus on connecting households, the entire family benefits, including students. So just be mindful of that naturally, because of the school year, a lot of the times we are focusing on connecting students because of the urgency of them being able to participate in their curriculum. But we also need to think about, who are the other residents that we're not reaching that need economic opportunity, people who might be newly displaced from work, who are now going to have to go and find work in places that they have to risk their health instead of being able to get them opportunities online. Or also thinking about, I think all the time about arts and culture. What are we doing about thinking about creating opportunities for us to maintain that? Because arts and culture is part of the reason why some people live in the areas they live. And so if we don't find a way for people to experience that, even, the way that we go to theaters or concerts, all of that has changed for the foreseeable future. So it's not going to be enough to just hope that gets better on the sidelines. That's something that's integral to our community. So I just think it's important for us to keep thinking about how can we support all of those components that add texture and depth to our communities, not just the things that are the fires that we actually just need to put out.
I know Emily has some insight on this.
Thanks, Wade. I have been working extensively with communities, getting them connected to technology, and unfortunately, PSD doesn't have enough computers and hotspots for folks, and so we're still seeing kids not being able to connect to the internet, and some kids haven't connected to their school since COVID hit in March, and they've been out of school this entire time and still haven't reconnected. And I think that aspect of family is so important, because we're seeing that even if we get a kid a computer, if they're in elementary school, their parents may not know how to turn on their computer and turn on the internet and access a hotspot. And so they're doing a lot of that training on their phone, and they don't have a computer of their own. And if one of them lost a job, how do you apply for a job if the library is closed? And so I think, as you so gracefully and eloquently pointed out, all the issues that we are seeing with technology have just been exacerbated by COVID, and just not only the impacts to learning, but also to the economic opportunities that folks are going to have. And so, I think we just have areas in our city that aren't connected to the internet, and even with broadband rolling that out, as Coleman and Nina have been in many meetings with me trying to figure out how to build out internet into something like a mobile home community, and the challenges associated with that, and the pricing and the technology, and then the training. The training is the needs are just so extensive to get training to folks, and having people who can take it down to a level of turning your computer on, what the different portals are for. And just that level it takes certain people. And so anyways, that's more just a rant. And so, but I think just, it's just, we are seeing this exacerbated so heavily because of COVID. And I appreciate Coleman and Nina and their work that they've been bringing to this. And I know Nina working a lot on that technology and education piece and with our digital equity. But I think that conversation of is 995, and I think ours is higher than 995, too high? And what happens when that is? And how are we connecting people to something that you mentioned earlier about that 995 through the federal,
the Lifeline program.
Yeah, that Lifeline. And are we connecting people to the Lifeline through broadband and just all those things? So yes, I was working on this earlier today, so it was a nice tie-in, and I don't know if that helped at all, Wade, but yes, it's just.
Emily, I knew you'd be jumping up and down, so I knew you'd have a lot to add.
Yeah, and through my day job, just working, we're training 16 Spanish speakers on going to the community and knocking on doors and saying, hey, have you gotten your kid connected? And what are these barriers? And let me call your teacher. And it's just the amount of time and resources it takes to connect families
I want to point out something you said about English, when English is a second language, so just nationwide, when we think about who's disconnected, if you are part of one of those, what they call marginalized communities, the most disconnected populations, that number actually goes even higher when the parents are non-English speakers. So usually when we know that the parents are non-English speakers, there's usually a barrier to adoption at the front door. One thing that I don't think that people very often, I was in a BDAC work group meeting, someone said that, well, it's not affordability, it's because they don't appreciate the technology. Stop right there. We actually have interviewed some of these people, and part of it is that some of them come from places where they did not trust government. So they were inherently distrustful of bringing any technology into the front door that could be used as a tool of surveillance. So it's not necessarily that they don't want the technology, they don't want to create trails when they're saying, I don't know what you're going to do with my information. So that's two parts where there's an opportunity for us to engage and actually disarm people and turn them into their own, community ambassadors, saying that I used it, my neighbor, you should use it too. Because very often when English is not the first language, people rely on word of mouth in the community. So there's an opportunity to turn them into ambassadors. And then secondly, when we're thinking about overall strategies, how do we actually account for that? Maybe we need to include privacy training as part of that curriculum for digital literacy, to think about not only getting people online, but this is how your information is used online. Because especially when people are logging on to libraries, these closed networks where they essentially have to trade their privacy to get online. And also what happens with school networks, they'll get disclaimers and they'll say, we have the right to do X, Y, and Z with your information. We need to take the additional step and make sure that people understand what are they giving up in order to use some of these public networks.
Very good. There's a question in the Q&A, and I think it's more of a clarification, but and Darren and staff, would you help clarify this? That approximately 89% of the residents have broadband access to. Is that a goal, or is that data?
So these are based on actual statistics. So I pulled statistics on Fort Collins, and I'm happy to share the source that I used. But it was households with a broadband internet subscription, and that includes fixed and cell phone connections, minimum 25.3. So that's what we were using to get those.
So that's data that you have access to nationally, and you aggregate it.
Yes, and I'm happy to share that. Megan and Jacqueline, I'm happy to send that to you. But I actually pulled a whole bunch of statistics on Fort Collins before we started.
No, that's great. And so, does that surprise anybody, or how does that stack up nationally?
Okay, so nationally for that category, it's at 90.3, and Fort Collins is at 89.1.
Okay.
So it's very similar. However, one thing I thought was interesting, you guys actually have a higher median income than the average. So the thing is, but you still have 16.8% for your poverty rate. So that means that you have a very large economic chasm when you do have the fall off, even though people are higher. So that was something that I thought was an interesting piece, because that's higher than the national average. And
the question I have on that is, how does the student population fall into that income? And that's, that's for us as, how does that data usually shake out? With 30,000 students, how does that shake out with, their family might have an income, but, but maybe not the individual here in our community, and how that data shows up?
Yeah, Wade, as soon as I saw or heard Francella say that, I instantly thought of students and student population, but I don't know if there's someone on the call that can speak to that. It's an interesting question. It's, a question that we're seeming to get a lot lately when we're talking about income levels and poverty and so forth. To what extent does the student population impact that?
And not to say that we don't have clearly people that are below the poverty line, but just how it's characterized in our community.
Well, and we all know that we have homeless students as well, and we have students who are absolutely on the side of poverty, and we sort of flippantly say, well, I was a poor college student at one time as well, and I was, but not to the extent that we're talking about here. Like I said, we have, and you know, I know, Wade, you see that often, but we have students who are living in vehicles and are in poverty. So Jackie, you look like you might have something to say in that, on that space or on that issue.
No, I was just checking with Beth if we know with that 16.8% how the students are. So, but I think, like you said, Darren, that keeps coming up when we talk about demographic data and generally. And so I think for us, just as a community, always being able to, whenever we can, talk about how students are considered in these numbers.
Yeah, again, I'll reiterate. I think we really need to be careful about saying, well, yeah, poor college students. We all went through that. I think we need to be very, very careful about that because I don't think that's accurate, and I think it's deceiving, and I think it undermines the significance of the challenge that some of our students in town are facing. So.
And we're seeing more non-traditional age. The U.S. News and World Report just came out, and it recognizes CSU for veterans, but you know that also, you know, that's a different challenging demographic in our community, and so you know I think you know, and our community colleges are typically non-traditional age students as well. So I think you know that. Yeah, a better understanding of what all that means is important. So, any other comments, questions, and from the panelists or attendees? Attendees, please, if you put it in the chat for a Q&A. And but anybody, we like to open it up and just have you know people that might have a burning question or a thought and contribute if they would. I'm not seeing any hands raised, but just want to let people know that they're welcome to provide some input now.
Wade, this is Nina, and
Hi,
I have a couple of things to share. One is when we talk about students and household poverty in this community, last year the program and performance evaluation team did an aggregate of trying to identify that student poverty and what impacts our overall poverty. So Jackie, we do have some really good work that I'll send over that we've done, and it identifies them. It reduces household poverty. It drops our 16% falling below household poverty to 12%, but that's based on households, so not individuals. So it's a really tough kind of number to pin down, right? But also tied to that is, as I'm working with Code for America on this partnership to really develop an online platform for income qualified programs, one of the things we keep moving around is the kind of the less of a dependency on an AMI, on our area median income, and being able to base eligibility on these other factors. And this is primarily driven because of our student population. So if we get to that idea that there are students that their AMI may reflect their parents' filing and not their status. So we want to kind of, again, shift our dependency from just a hard number that's captured in our taxes versus indicators like single parent or neighborhood poverty indicators, and all of these other elements that go into really a barrier or your access to technology or other programs. So I think there's some exciting work that Code for America will bring to the table in eligibility.
Thank you, Nina. Appreciate that. Other questions, comments? Let's see. Right now, we're ready for next steps. What do you see any next steps where we might go? Thoughts? I think Nina outlined some there with Code for America, and we have, you know, that is a complementary aspect to this as well. I'm thinking about from a city council standpoint of you know, where we're thinking of barriers and adoption. So really thinking about outcomes in a deeper sort of way than just deployment, and what that might mean. Any other thoughts of next steps?
Wade, I have something quickly, maybe to, help the Futures Committee as well. One of the things that Coleman and I have talked about several times over the last year or so, and Nina as well, is, as we're coming into, pulling the next 1,000,000 feet of fiber, there are some really critical things that we need to talk about. We need to talk about it's really about leverage. So Fort Collins in 2022 is going to have a completely fiber to every premise network that will be operating well, that will have a good market share, will be driving take rates, hopefully, on and on and on. But I think, the bigger question from a smart cities perspective is, how are we going to leverage this? So how do we help people? How do we help leverage commerce and digital medicine and all kinds of things, and with the university and beer making and chip making and on and on and on, and entrepreneurs. So I will tell you, I think, and that's why I think this session with Futures Committee is really good, because what we're going to have to do is now think about the next step of this thing, and that is this smart city network. So I think about the topic we've talked about today, but also, how do we leverage? I mean, there's a group Coleman and I are aware of. In fact, I'm speaking at one of their sessions tomorrow called Ignite, and Ignite advocates for a structure where you have, between the community and the municipal broadband provider, a non-for-profit layer where they come in and they're advocating, and they're trying to do that, a lot of that leverage with business and with non-for-profits and philanthropy. So I don't think it's too early. I think last year would have been too early, but now being a third of the way in. The other conversation I think we need to have, which is a little bit off topic, is, and I'm not even positive that state law is authorizing at this point, but we've got some neighbors who are saying, we like what you're doing, and we want to talk about that. So what's happening in Wellington, and what's happening in Tinmouth, and not Loveland? They're building their municipal broadband utility now. So I guess I would just say, I think we've got a lot of policy work and a lot of leverage conversations that we probably ought to be starting in 2021.
Right. And I appreciate that, and I completely agree. I see Karen Champagne and Teresa Connor, as we think about our utilities, we think about our transportation infrastructure and vehicle to cloud and so forth. What does it mean for our community to be connected in all the services that, so we think of our residents in terms of their connectivity and their ability to high-speed broadband and symmetric and having that in a ubiquitous fashion. But as we think about our infrastructure moving forward as a city, that should be very much thought of in the same way, in terms of what are the barriers and what are the access point, and the adoption. Because I think our community will benefit in so many ways beyond just their ability to connect their device to a high-speed network. And it's going to be all different kinds of devices. One that they might be driving, whether it's a micro mobility or whether it's another kind of vehicle, or whether it's a transit system or what have you, and safety as we move to Vision Zero, in terms of accident rates and things like that, or as we think about, I'm thinking right now of our wastewater utility doing COVID testing as a pre-indicator to infections of individuals, and things like that. That's health within our community. So those kind of aspects that how are we thinking about them as an integrated system, not just one-offs, and we need to be thinking in terms of architectures. And I know that Kevin's on this call as well. I've had some good conversations with Kevin, and thinking about our our information infrastructure in a way that's more than just you know, how we might be updating our Microsoft 365. It's way beyond that in terms of connectivity to our community.
Mayor, if I may, that's a great segue. I do want, Coleman, I don't want to surprise you, but and I will say it is a great partnership, as Darren alluded to, as Connection and Coleman and his team bring on the infrastructure and all the technical aspects. And I run alongside them and really kind of we shape and build our digital equity program. There's a real kind of compatibility going back and forth. And Coleman, you'll hear about it later from your staff, but what we did earlier today is, as we talk about digital equity, it goes beyond resident and household connectivity, right? So we brainstormed a little bit about today about what does it mean to businesses in terms of a reduced rate? Is it new businesses? Does it help minority-owned businesses? Does it help, you know, women, female-owned businesses? What can we do to really strengthen the business economy in terms of their connectivity and bring them on as introductory customers for a lifetime of being connected? And then when we look at businesses, we also have to look at nonprofits, right? And is there a way for digital equity to also subsidize that connectivity for our nonprofits and our nonprofit partners? So there's a lot of space there in even the Digital Equity Foundation to keep building on that into community partnerships, businesses, academics, schools, churches, all of those next steps that also will benefit and thrive as a result of access to connection. It's exciting. You'll get the memo, Coleman. We didn't make any decisions without you, but boy, we had a big brainstorming session.
Sounds like you're pretty close, though.
Yeah. No, we didn't. We didn't. Because there's a lot of, it's a great place. What we kind of decided was actually it's a great place to start, and we need to actually start looking at what role digital equity can play in that business and nonprofit space.
Yeah, and I think it's important, you know, when we talk about adoption rate for digital, you know, literacy and stuff like that, that you understand that different people have different needs and different wants, right? So for a large section of the community, socialization is a huge benefit to having internet access. You know, Nina, as you said, it could be for business development, telemedicine, you know, learning, skills development past, you know, once you're out of high school. You know, there are a lot of different needs, and we need to understand them all and try to help people take the advantage that they can of the system that we're building. And kind of going back to what Darren said, you know, we kind of were, you know, in that 1 year we're starting to build, but in 2021, we really need to be thinking about partnerships and what we want this to be, you know, as a platform for the city to use to develop on, whatever that means to that person. So there's a lot of opportunities here, and for the mayor, you know, we're starting to look at how we can leverage it for electric system, right? So we're already talking about some pilots on how we can densify information that's being pulled back for their SCADA and their new ADMS. And there's a lot that we can grow just on the electric side, you know, down the road. That's just one internal use that's going to have a lot of benefit. Traffic is another area that has a lot of potential. So we need to start thinking about these things and start, you know, teeing them up, because if we don't start next year, then it'll be 3 years or 4 years before we start seeing the benefit.
Yeah. And I'd just like to say, in being a platform for innovation, I think of, you know, the community person that actually created a train app that actually helps inform community where, you know, the train's going to be crossing intersections. And, you know, that was just grassroots within our community. Francella?
And I just wanted to add something that Nina said that I thought was such an important point. She said something about what do we do to make sure that nonprofits and businesses can be not broadband subscribers for life. And I think how exciting would that be if you can think about being the type of community where in every single building, just like you turn the lights on, everyone has some sort of connection. So what is it going to take to make that happen? Are we going to need to talk to real estate, you know, like agents and builders to say, ask questions about why isn't it in this home or this business? Or do we need to partner with X? Like just thinking about how that has like an exponential effect on the community, because it's not just the immediate benefit, it's being able for people to age in place when we're talking about isolation, or being able to attract new populations. And so there are so many far-reaching benefits that come come from being able to make sure that it's in every single corner of the community.
That's a good question. What about building code and making requirements? I'm thinking of where it's a multi-family, you know, and provider. There's a
Yeah, you're talking about multi-unit,
right.
MDUs, multi-dwelling units. Yeah.
Right. There's that, and you know, but from a building code perspective, you know, that could be a requirement, just like we have fire rating of walls, and you know, so and you know, it does, you know, we're in a competitive space, but you know, that doesn't mean we can't utilize our building codes and other things as well. Or
And I think sometimes just asking the question is a really important place, because I think sometimes people, I think in their minds are like, oh, we can't do that. And it's like, well, why not? And so one of the people, I remember the mayor of Mount Vernon, I don't know if you've ever met Jill Boudreau, but I know that several cities and counties around her wanted information. So they started training and sharing their ordinances and their templates with other cities. So they were like, this is how we did it. And so I think just asking the question forces people to say, even if we're not sure, we can at least explore the possibilities.
You bet. No, that's great. And Francella, does Next Century Cities work with the National League of Cities?
Sometimes. So Angela Panettiere is there. She handles their digital portfolio. So we actually work together on a digital equity coalition, but National League of Cities is right now entrenched on the cities. It's their, basically they're trying to get support from Congress to help city budgets. But yes, but Angelina and I work on a digital equity coalition.
So basically we get involved in National League of Cities various ways. I'm involved in transportation technology, and I know Emily and Julie get involved as well. So that's another way that we share a lot and work together and on policy related things as well.
Definitely.
Other things that for the good of the whole. I appreciate Karen opining, as well as Teresa, as it relates to integration of infrastructure, and you know, I think there's good alignment with our city staff, our community, with respect to connectivity, and I think as you've talked about equity and inclusion today, I think that also marries well. That's a council priority for this council, and so as we look at the different lenses, is where it's affordable housing, or now with our digital inclusion, you know, that's very much a priority of this council. So your presentation, you're you know, stimulating us to think and beyond where maybe we've been spending our time, I think is the whole purpose of why we have these conversations. So any other comments to share?
If I could just,
yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead. No, Francella, go ahead, please.
Okay, I wanted to share, since I just had a second, I wanted to share this quote from a Boston city official, and he actually sent it in last week, and I thought that it was worth, it was basically, when we do our city spotlights, we found that we actually get some of the most authentic comments when we call on the phone. And very often people will submit questionnaires that are very heavily vetted by their comms people, and then we get very candid, tender moments when we ask them on the phone. And so Brittany Ray asked Mr. Lynch, he is the broadband officer for City of Boston. She said, well, so what do you want people, you know, your residents to know about what you guys are doing in this office? And he lit up and he was like, I'm so glad that you asked that question. And this is what he said, quote, he said, the work is not done. Everybody discovered over the last 6 months that connectivity is a must-have, and people who may not have been that interested or didn't see the immediate need are now pressed into understanding that we have a need for connectivity. We're scrambling to fill in those gaps of failed federal policies that have not made digital connectivity universally available or affordable to all. And I think that it encapsulated the desperation, but / the deep-seated commitment, knowing that this is inherently local. And so it would be great if the federal government and state governments were able to coalesce around a national strategy, but the onus is essentially on local governments to solve this problem. And so I just want to applaud you for your leadership and your willingness to even think through possibilities. And I encourage you to make this part of the thinking through an ongoing part of your strategy, to reevaluate, to ask questions, to push each other, to invite new voices into the space, just to think it through.
Wow, that's awesome. And I think, Jackie, you're usually the one that summarizes, but I think that was a great summary. So thank you. But anything else for the good of the whole and on this? So thank you, Francella, so much for joining us and being a part of our meeting. And we're so, we're so blessed in many ways. And that is, just the topic here, the access to having thought leaders join us in our community in a way that helps us, stimulates thinking and so forth. So, and for us to even get better and think about things in harder ways. So thank you so much. You bet.
Thanks so much, you guys.
You bet. Thanks. So with that,
thank you.
Yeah, that's right. See, we get a good audience. So, and Jackie, other topics? Is that where we are?
Yeah. No, and Francella, I think the proactive posture, I think, is the official pose of the Futures Committee. So thank you you just gave us so many nuggets that were so perfect for the Futures Committee. So thank you, and looking forward to just continued partnership with you in Next Century Cities. So I just wanted to highlight, and it's going to actually be a really connected topic, that in October, we're going to resume. If you remember, we had to reschedule our last Futures Committee on the future of work. We have rescheduled that person, Jean Meister. Huge thanks to our Chief Human Resource Officer, Teresa Roche, for connecting someone through her network. Jean she had a Forbes article recently about COVID and the future of work that just exploded in popularity. We'll resend that out with her bio to you all as this context. She's the founding partner of Future Workplace and just a real forward-thinking professional in the field of human resources and work. And so that will be our October speaker. We still have your short list of topics that we're working off of in terms of slotting additional meetings. The mayor and Darren and I and Megan are meeting tomorrow to discuss what potential speakers might be in December and November, and also into early 2021. And so if either now or at next Futures meeting, or even via email, if you have additional speakers or topics that you want to add to kind of that prioritized shortlist, please do let us know, because we're going to be, we've tried to slot enough so that we have some planning, but also leave some openings in case there's something that we really want to put in on the agenda. So, and this was, as we all said, a really timely topic that is also future oriented. So I guess I'll pause there and see if there's any that you would like to add right now, any of the committee members, for the conversation with the mayor and Darren tomorrow. And if not, then we're set for our speaker next month, and we'll continue the planning process to engage other thought leaders for this committee.
Thank you. Any final comments, Emily or Julie? Thank you so much. We'll wrap it up. I think great meeting, great presentation, and appreciate the conversation by all. I always leave these meetings energized in ways, but also challenged in ways that I think is always very healthy. So anything for the good of the group? Francella, thank you again. And you're actually in your evening, so thank you for joining us in your evening. Okay. All right. Good night, everybody. We stand adjourned.